Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 2016 Nonprofit Leadership Development Webinar Series. It is June 16th, and today we are talking about baseline budgeting. Excited to have you here with me today, and we'll look forward to seeing your questions come through via the chat function as we go through the webinar here today. As we prepare for our time together, ask you to take a moment and just reflect on why you invested this time today. Very important as you think about your leadership as a nonprofit staff person, board member, volunteer, consultant, however you're involved with the sector, really understanding what are you hoping to get out of your time here today. That should inform some of the questions that you might create as we go through the session here this afternoon. So in order to focus, encourage you to close the door to outside distractions. If you're in a conference room or perhaps in an office setting, that you close that door so you can focus very specifically on what we'll be sharing here today, which is also important to silence your electronic devices, particularly if you're joining with others who are also viewing the webinar with you. So to put those electronic devices into a silent mode so that they don't interrupt your thinking or perhaps the thinking of someone with you. And then it would encourage you as well to turn off the other applications on your computer, particularly email, which tends to have that interruptible capability for having a ding or a notice come through on your screen. So I would encourage you to go ahead and turn off those applications. And then, of course, to get comfortable in your surroundings. This is some time for you, some time to listen and ponder, reflect, learn, and we all do that better in terms of retention when we're more comfortable. So some of the logistics for the webinar portion of our brown bag today. Attendees will be muted during the call, so you can be speaking with one another or to yourself as you're pondering something, and that should not come through on the line. If you are getting an echo, you may need to switch to a headset or to a telephone call-in, so to take care through that process. And then, as I mentioned earlier, if you do have a question, please use that chat function to send a message to me, and we'll work to answer that in real time or certainly before 1 p.m. Central Time today when we will log off from our session. So with that, thank you for coming to Baseline Budgeting here today. Looking forward to sharing information with you about this really critical aspect of nonprofit leadership and obviously nonprofit sustainability. First, a bit about me. I'm Melanie Schmidt, the lead consultant and founder for Timpano Group. I've had the great opportunity over the years to manage financial analysis and reporting for a variety of organizations, including forecasting as well as analysis and audit processes. So have that experience to bring into the conversation, as well as a strong belief that money moves the mission. Even for organizations with smaller budgets or non-existent budgets, there's still resources involved and there's still some money that is really moving that mission forward and moving your purpose forward. And also bring over 20 years of expertise in nonprofit governance and overall engagement strategies, having served in all sectors and also focusing specifically on the nuances of nonprofits. So that is a bit about me. More information available through LinkedIn as well as at our website, timpanogroup.com. Today's discussion, we're going to focus primarily in 3 areas. So we'll focus on some lingo, important to have a shared language as you're thinking about budgeting for your nonprofit. We'll also talk through a bit of logic in terms of some of the common sense practices and some uncommon practices perhaps for how you may be doing things today so that you can have some information to carry forward in terms of process and structure as well. So lingo, logic, and process are the areas of emphasis for us here today. And it's such a critical topic in large part because of the fact that for some it is deemed to be very scary, and it doesn't need to be. Baseline budgeting and good budgeting is something that people are very familiar with. And so once we have a bit more familiarity with the language, some understanding of good logic behind budgeting processes and structures, we're really able to come together well as boards and leaders for the sector. So that is looking at knowing why we have to go through this topic generally is also just in framing that goes back to needing money to move the mission forward. I mean, if you think about effective nonprofits, they really know what it means to plan for their needs and then to ensure that they have the accountability in place to really deliver on the promises that they're making to the very supporters and the very stakeholders who are giving of their time, their talent, and their treasures, all to help realize this beautiful intended outcome to fulfill that purpose. And effective nonprofits are doing this to really make a difference and to avoid what can happen in terms of unnecessary despair. And we'll talk about some strategies for mitigating that for your nonprofit and also mitigating that as a leader in the sector. And it's a really critical topic as well because few boards want to fire an executive director or displace an officer or really have to make decisions that affect staffing negatively. And fewer boards want to do that or be forced into a decision about dissolution simply because they can't make payroll. So the critical concepts for thinking about baseline budgeting is to not allow you, your board, your organization to get into that position. And so it involves planning and it involves having a budget that's developed by people who really understand what's involved with delivering. And so we have to also remember that money doesn't just come with the mission. For any of you Odd Couple fans out there, this isn't as if the gravy just comes with the meat. There's a process for extracting those juices from the meat and for turning it into some deliciousness that goes along with having a great dinner. And a budget is the same way. It's about really extracting good information from your organization and putting it together with the full complement of things to move things forward. And so when we think about the basics of good budgeting, one of the key questions is really who does what when it comes to setting the budget. And one of the consistent aspects of that is to remember that who does what ultimately involves the board of directors passing that budget. And so the board is accountable for setting the direction for the mission, ensuring the resources, and providing critical oversight for the organization. And so as a board member, as a leader in that way, you have the responsibility for ensuring that the budget process is robust, that the budget is set, that the budget is also monitored. And that is informed by committee chairs, by financial staff of the organization, by the executive directors, by volunteers, by a variety of individuals. And so we'll talk through a bit later how some of those groups can come together and some of the questions that they can answer to really ensure that we're moving a good budget process forward. Another basic is to really ask about structuring the budget process itself and remembering that in that, you really have to find a method that works for you. And so there are some basics, some fundamentals that we'll talk through this afternoon. And then you need to figure out how those basics live and work within your organization. And so it may depend upon your size. It may depend upon the savvy of your executive director. It may depend upon whether or not you have a chief financial officer or a director of finance function. It will also depend upon the savvy and the expertise of those board members we referenced earlier. And it's important to remember that in terms of who's doing what and how we structure that process, we cannot fool ourselves, that there are flaws on all sides of the equation. And so it's really important to build that budgeting system on strong fundamentals. And when you do that, you're setting yourself and your nonprofit up for some truly sustainable success. And so it's really important to remember that the board has a legal responsibility, and then the staff and the committees will help inform that structure. And so another key component to think about is, when should we be talking budgets? Some will say the answer to that is you should be talking budgets all the time because you're building the budget and then you're monitoring the budget. But we'll talk through some guidelines for you to think about for ways to really identify when you should start reviewing your budget processes and building your budget for the upcoming year. And so when you should be talking about that is early and often. Another question that will come up when you think about good budgeting is, why do we need controls? Why do we need to have systems or processes in place that are essentially a check and balance? And it's important because we're required to have those controls. That's one of the good reasons in the basics of good budgeting, is that you're required to have controls, but it also lends greater confidence for staff members, for board members, for donors, for others who really want to believe and understand that you are a well-run and a strong fiduciary for the purpose and the mission that you're moving through the community. And another key question that will come up in the basics of good budgeting is, where do we go from here? So what we'll talk about at the end are some of the steps that you can take, not only of where you go from this webinar into your budgeting processes, but also where your organization can go and where you can go to get more good information about resources and other things to move those processes forward. So those are some of the key components for looking at baseline budgeting and doing it well. And lingo, as we mentioned, is very important in terms of having that shared language and the shared understanding. So what we're going to do now is break down budget. And a budget is an estimate of costs, revenues, and resources. So this is an estimate of the money that is going out of your organization, the money that's coming into your organization, as well as the other supportive resources that may be flowing in and out of your organization. And so ultimately, it's simply an estimate. And it's an estimate that is built based upon a strong foundation of historic information and future projections. But fundamentally, it's an estimate of cost, revenues, and resources over a specified period of time. And so the budget that you are building for your organization, or when you're thinking about budgeting, a perfectly appropriate question to ask is, are we looking at an annual budget, a 3-year budget, a 5-year budget, to get that time frame in mind? And that's important to be thinking about, because as a nonprofit organization, we typically will be thinking on an annual budget basis. Most organizations are looking at having that 1-year budget so that they can plan on a very finite basis. The opportunity that nonprofits particularly have is truly to start looking at multi-year budgets, where you may be looking at a 3 to 5-year budget projection of the costs, the revenue, and the resources required to move the mission, in part because development in the nonprofit sector is much longer play. It takes longer to bring those revenues into the organization, and you're also looking at impact over a longer period of time. And so if you want to move towards sustainability, you have that opportunity to start thinking about budgeting over a longer period of time as well. And it can provide a really useful roadmap for you as you think about moving the organization forward and prioritizing your resources. And so again, the budget, looking at the costs, the revenues, and the resources over a specified period of time, and it is reflecting projections of future financial conditions and organizational goals. And so the budget process is a really wonderful way to take that vision for the organization, the goals that the board and the staff have created together and put forward, and really put the financial underpinnings to ensuring that it comes to fruition and that you're able to sustain it. And so the budget is very much forward-looking, based upon past experiences and projections or estimates about what's happening in the future. And so that is your basic lingo breakdown on a budget, that costs, revenues, and resources over a specified period of time, reflecting projections of future financial conditions and organizational goals. And in doing that, then another component is, if we know what the budget is, we can start to build up why the budget is valuable. And as a leader, what you need to be thinking about for how you can use that budget as a tool to move the organization forward, to enhance your own understanding, and to enhance your own effectiveness on behalf of the nonprofit organization. And so the budget is really a framework that allows you to monitor progress against your objectives. If we go back to having broken down the budget and thinking about it's a reflection of the resources and the revenues and the expenses involved with moving your objectives forward, your budget is giving you a very concrete means by which to check and balance how you're doing. You've projected where you think you might be going, and the budget is a framework to then monitor progress based upon your financial activity. The budget is also a standard by which you can measure performance. And so again, if you think about building up that budget based upon historic information, estimates, and trends of where you believe the organization is going, that's setting a standard for performance with the organization. And the budget, when you start doing your comparisons of actuals against budget, is really a way to measure your performance. You can start to see where you're exceeding expectations or perhaps where you're not meeting those expectations, and have really robust conversations as staff members, as board members, as leaders about what that means, what the implications are, and how you can really move the organization forward. Because a budget is also an incredibly valuable device for adapting to the unforeseeable. And if we are in the nonprofit sector, we do know that change is constant and things happen on the landscape we cannot possibly predict. And so the budget helps you adapt to something you didn't even plan for, because you can use it as a tool to say, this is our budget, this is what we thought was going to happen, something shifted in our landscape, how is that now going to affect our budget that we have drafted and has been approved? And then you can start reassessing priorities with a strong understanding of the financial ramifications of that, which inevitably are leading to the sustainability of that as well. And so the value of a budget is also beginning to understand what kind of budget do you need and what's your process for doing that. And that becomes incredibly important, particularly on the process, because you need to understand, how are we going to use this budget? How am I going to use it as a tool to evaluate the organization and help support it going forward? And so that means that a solid budget is based in reality. Solid budget is built upon historic trends and information, and that it means that you're going to incorporate your stretch targets as things change, but that they need to be based on something true and on something real. You can't just plop the numbers in there to make it look better. And I have worked with organizations over the years who have suffered from the cut and paste budgeting methodology, where it was taking, all right, this is what our budget was last year, we'll keep this section the same, we'll add 1% here, and we'll add 3% here. And then boom, there you go. Or other areas of deficiency have been those budgeting processes where you carry forward what your projected expenses and then just put balancing revenue and make it up as you go without looking at any trends. And it's really important to remember that while that makes the process easier, it diminishes the value of the process. And so what we encourage people to do is to build up that valuable budget by looking to history and planning for the future. And so in thinking about that, it's really important to know specifically what type of budget do you need for your organization within the specified period of time that you've identified. And so many of us are used to thinking about break-even budgeting, and that goes along with that. We have our expenses, the money that's going out, and so we'll offset that with the revenues or the money that's coming in. We'll break even. That will be acceptable and often preferred, simply because that is how most people think about nonprofits. There's not a profit, and so they will say break even is the preferred or the appropriate way. But in fact, there are 3 budget types that are available to nonprofit organizations. And it's important to remember those three types because we have to sometimes break our own habits. We often will struggle as leaders within the nonprofit sector. We have this habit of break even simply because that's what we see, that's what we're told, and that we're used to break even contracts from foundations or government. And so that's that situation where we're proving that we've spent exactly what we've raised. And while grants and contracts may well be designed to break even, organizations aren't. Organizations and healthy organizations really require that excess cash to be generated in some years. And that allows for growth. And so that's where you'll see the three budget types of a surplus, the deficit, and the break even coming into play. And so there are times when you're going to need to increase your reserves or pay down some debt. And so this is a situation where you'll adopt a surplus budget. And this is where you decide as an organizational leader that your cash or your reserves are not what you ideally would like them to be. And again, remember, we're estimating for future conditions in the budgeting process. And so what we need to do sometimes is plan to generate more income than we will have in expenses so that we can create a surplus to fund growth for future years. This could also be done to help pay down some debt or ease cash flow. And so you have to then develop the budget process and draft the budget by setting some realistic income targets. Again, looking at how much money we've raised historically as an organization, what opportunities do we have with our current donor or funder bases, and then how can we capitalize on that? And so that if you can deliver on this surplus budget, you'll have that higher net asset and net worth at the end of the year, a stronger financial position, and an opportunity to help grow the organization in very meaningful ways. And a thing to consider with your surplus budgeting is talking with your stakeholders in advance, after the fact, on an ongoing basis about this as a very deliberate strategy for your organization. Talk about the growing needs in your community, the need for greater service, greater administrative requirements, what's really driving the potential growth for your organization and why you need that surplus in order to meet that. And it is an acceptable conversation, and it is definitely an acceptable approach for nonprofits to use. And so that one of the opportunities you have is to adopt a surplus budget. Then there's the familiar, the break-even budget, and that is really where you aren't gaining ground right now, but you're also not losing ground. You're really riding through on momentum. And this is often the choice by default. It's often the choice by habit. And it's also a choice that will result when there is not as much good information about where the organization might need to go or historical trend information to be had. And so what an opportunity you have if you're used to break-even budgeting is to consider doing a few scenarios where you might have your traditional budget, and then to challenge your finance committee or your staff leaders who are helping to bring this together to say, what if? What if we had 10% more? What if we had 10% less? And to go through the process of what implications could that have on the overall planning for the organization. So the break even is the one that we're typically most familiar with. There are also, you can adopt a deficit budget. And this is where you are very deliberately understanding and planning that for a specified period of time, your expenses are going to outweigh the resources and revenues that are coming in. Often you'll see this happening, again, in a very deliberate fashion. This is something that is actually planned. And it's when you really decide that you need to spend down reserves or that some reserves that you have are more than sufficient. And so you may need to make a one-time purchase or expense. For instance, this has come up for some nonprofit organizations when they have identified the need to overhaul their websites. And to change their platform or to move to a technology system that really will provide longer term advantage, but requires a substantial upfront investment. What you may see that organization do is then in that budgeting year, they will plan for an overall deficit at the end of the year because they're making an investment in the organization. They're bringing down the reserves or the dollars that are available with an understanding of needing to enhance the resources over time. And so a one-time expense is typically a time when you would see an organization do a deficit budget. You might also see that deficit budget occurring when an organization is looking to invest in building capacity. And so they're investing in themselves, perhaps in hiring new staff, building their fundraising capacity, also providing a greater expansion of services. And so again, in a very deliberate way, they're saying we're going to make an investment in the organization, and it means that at the end of the year, our expenses are going to outpace our incoming revenue and our available reserves. And that is not uncommon. And again, the key component to that is that it's about planning for the future. And this is not something that should happen by default. Because you simply can't come up with the money, or you don't believe you're going to have the fundraising revenues to sustain your standard services. If you don't believe that you're having the revenues in this forecasted future, then that's where you need to do the assessment of how are we going to cut some of our expenses, be that through programs, staffing, pencils, however that might come out. And so looking at that very deliberately of figuring out what's my budget type. Am I going to plan for a surplus? Am I going to break even? Or will I have a deficit budget situation? And it's important to know that in that process, what you're looking to do is to build reserves so that you can enhance capacity over time. So let's move into a bit in terms of some logic. When we think about baseline budgeting, there are some key components that we can put into place, some great rules of the road, if you will, for how we can have effective budgeting knowledge and strong leadership. So we mentioned before, a key rule of the road, the board is ultimately accountable for budgeting. And so with that, it's critical to think about what sort of expertise is available to the board and how is the board going to be monitoring that budget over time. And so if you have that knowing the board is ultimately accountable, this is an avenue for building a dashboard or a one-page listing of the metrics that you can use for how is the organization performing against expectations in areas like outcomes, finance, staffing, board engagement, all of those things that it takes to move the organization forward. Because remember from earlier, as we were building up our budget and finding its value, it's a multifaceted tool for the board to evaluate performance and to assess future needs. And so incredibly important to think about that as intentionally as possible and as deliberately as possible. Another rule of the road, nonprofit budgeting is not for-profit budgeting. There is a distinct difference in terms of how those processes happen and what considerations come into play when you're building a budget. And so really important to remember that there is a distinction, and this is not a distinction that's made from a business mindset, because while nonprofits, as I'm fond of saying, do not need to operate more like a business, because in fact they are businesses. They have business principles in play. Budgeting is one of those. And so it's really about finding the appropriate way to build that budget and to move it forward in a nonprofit specific mindset. Another rule of the road is that your financial position and your financial future are what dictate your budgeting. And so it's looking very explicitly at where you need to go into the future with the monetary consideration, with those financial resources at the forefront of your mind, so that in fact, that's what's dictating your budgeting. And then it's being influenced by stakeholder needs, considerations, landscapes, things of that nature. So those are some critical rules of the road. And we talk a lot about the board and the process for that. And so a key component as a leader in the nonprofit sector is to not be the person who's covering their ears, not listening to what's being said or what the numbers are showing us, and to not wanting to be involved in that process. Strong nonprofit leadership hinges on being financially literate and financially savvy about the organization that you're serving or the organization for which you're advocating. And so it's incredibly important to really embrace the leadership potential and to know that if you approach a nonprofit organization or are approached and really can speak to the importance of financial literacy, financial acumen, and strong budgeting processes, you are enhancing your value and becoming a stronger strategic asset for that organization. So it's important that everyone's participating in that process. I mentioned a moment ago about the difference between for-profit and nonprofit, and this was some information that came forward from Smithsonian's Design for the Other 90%, and it does a good job of really giving that visual reference for how their distinction is really important. You'll see budgeting is critical in both sides, in both sectors, but budgeting is really an opportunity for nonprofits to embrace their business side. It's because, as I said earlier, it's not about operating more like a business. It's about understanding that nonprofits are business and that you can then use the tools at your disposal to make smart business decisions and enhance your community impact. And so this isn't a question of nonprofit versus for-profit. It's just a reality of needing money to move the mission forward. And that, in fact, if you think about how those processes work, the distinctions are really important. You can see in the one graphic on the for-profit side of the equation, the customer is providing direct feedback on the product to the company. So in essence, they're funding it. And yet, as we know, a nonprofit is typically receiving funding from a party that is disconnected from the person who's actually receiving those services or that product. And so in essence, it raises the bar. And so in ensuring a longer-term view for how money is being used efficiently, how money is being used effectively, becomes that much more important to have strong budgeting processes and strong budgeting principles in play for your organization. And so the people really need to understand the financials of the business, and that is just a fundamental basic truth. And in the nonprofit sector particularly, we really need to heed a cautionary tale because we have to remember not all executive directors have that basic understanding or the basic foresight to look out for their own interests. And in that case, it's their own jobs. Not all boards have the expertise to advise the executive director on warning signs or best practices. And so today, that's why it's so important that you're here to change that, because you'll be enhancing financial literacy for yourself, for those around you, for your organization. But we need to be cautious, and we need to keep that in mind as we think about communicating, budgeting, and enhancing that knowledge. That the board cannot solely rely on an executive director, and the executive director cannot always rely on its board. It's a shared function and a shared expertise that needs to be addressed in board recruitment, in executive director recruitment, and ongoing professional development, and in staff selection and the population of committees or work groups that are serving the board for this purpose. And so part of that leads into bringing together an informed budget. And that informed budget is one that has input from the executive director. It has input from a finance committee. It has input from department leaders and managers within the organization. And it has input from committee chairs. And so all of the people who are doing the support for the organization and the advising for the organization are bringing some very critical points into that conversation. And everyone needs to be involved because everyone is bringing in a different perspective and a different interaction with the budget. For instance, program directors, they need to be involved up front in the process because inevitably they're the ones who are going to have to live with the outcome. And they need to be able to be engaged as the board starts to push and pull the numbers, because the department leaders, the department managers have a very strong sense for ramifications of a little bit here or a little bit there. And so it's really important to have that departmental staff and the people who are there in the trenches involved throughout the process, because they're the ones who know what it takes. So engage them, respect them, ask them to do early drafts for your finance committee, and then make sure you have a strong finance committee. So put some people on there who are on your board, who bring that expertise, bring people in from the community who also will lend those talents to the organization. And so bring them into your fold, educate them about the mission, the landscape, the nuances, and then really let them guide that process of creating the informed budget. And so that also comes from committee chairs having the responsibility for thinking ahead to the work that their committee is involved with and what resources may be required or what major expenditures might be on the horizon. And so each of those groups really can be asking themselves 5 key questions. And so each group can be thinking about what are the trends that we're seeing in the work that we're doing, in the costs, in the revenues that are required to do it. What are we seeing? Typically over a 3 to 5 year period can be a good use of time. Your trend data might also be influenced by a major milestone for your organization. So for instance, if you quadrupled your staff a year ago, you have to consider that in your trends. But looking at what historical information do we see? Then looking at what are the gaps. That may be the history of how we've been doing things, but perhaps there are gaps that have occurred in terms of your ability to move the mission in certain areas because you didn't have enough resources, or you were over-resourced in one area and under-resourced in another. So looking at critically, what are those gaps? Also important to think about what is staying the same. And with that, that may be that there's no change in your program or services. Perhaps what's staying the same is the level of government funding that you'll be receiving, whatever that might be, but to ask specifically what's staying the same so that then you can ask what's changing. Are we anticipating to see a major gift come in that we've been cultivating for 3 years? Do we see a change coming forward with the retirement of an executive director or a key staffer? How are we thinking about that future? And then ultimately for each group to have looked through the trends, the gaps, the landscape, and think about what's our plan? What about our plan for the future? And what are we doing to move that mission forward as an organization? So by gathering that information from those critical stakeholders, you can have a more informed budget, and you're able to move that mission forward by having a clearer understanding of the money and the resources required. So let's talk a bit about process. And I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to actually have a budget process. And so this means it's not one person who goes into a dark room and comes back with a spreadsheet that everyone nods at or says, why is the postage line 15% higher than it was last year? And then they approve the budget. A process is something that's actually written down. It's something that's documented. It's something that can be referenced, it can be checked, it can be leveraged. It's that thing that becomes a shining light for the organization in times of turmoil, so that if you do suffer a staff turnover, if you do see extreme growth that's diverting your attention in other areas, the documented process becomes your beacon. And it's really a wonderful management tool so that you can achieve greater sustainability. And so if we think about process, again, remembering that the process of creating your budget gives you a lot more insight about your business than the budget itself. And so this is a wonderful quote that reinforces the value, not just of the budget as a tool, but more so the process of creating it, because it's the time in the life cycle where you're really examining what it takes to move the organization forward. And so it's incredibly important to think about a flow for your budget. And so with that flow, this is an annual budgeting checklist that is a great resource from the Nonprofits Assistance Fund. And they put this together to really, again, help people think about the entire exploratory process of figuring out your budget. And so really where it starts is in determining your timeline. This is about working sort of from date of approval backward and ensuring that you're allowing time in each step for review and discussion. And so this goes along with creating a content calendar for your nonprofit board, where you're thinking about what are the milestones and when does the board need to be discussing things. Ultimately, your timeline is going to flow from the date of board approval, which should be before the beginning of your next fiscal year. And so that's the first thing, is to determine that timeline. Then you're going to need to agree on goals. This is the bartering aspect of your budgeting flow. So this is really where you start to prioritize program delivery. And this is, again, if you think about projecting ahead and moving the mission forward, you really need to build it off of your strategic framework or your operational plan, where you have your goals and objectives over a 1 to 3 to 5 year period identified, approved, and moving that forward, so that ultimately what you're doing in this space of the process is clarifying what your annual goals are going to be and what resources, cost, and the revenue and expenses required to move that forward. So once you've agreed upon those goals, then it's understanding what's our current financial status. And so with that, this is that opportunity to be pulling out the most current income and expense spreadsheets that you have and then comparing them to the budget. How did we do from what we had said we were going to do last year in terms of our budget, and then our actuals against that budget? And so to really look very specifically, this is where we are 6 months into the year, and then to do an assessment of the upcoming 6-month forecast. And so if you landed at this point in the process at June 30th, you'd be reviewing the first 6 months of financials for that year on an actual versus budget basis. And then you'd be doing an adjustment to your forecast looking ahead based upon what you've learned in the first 6 months of the year. And so it's important to know, going into a budget process, do we already know of things that are changing? And if so, let's be sure that that's informing our strong budget. So once you know what you want to accomplish for your organization and where you sit currently, you can agree on your budget approach. And so with this is really where you start to go in looking at assigning roles and responsibilities. Again, moving back to that documented process, who's taking on what role at what point in the process and what are their responsibilities. At this point, you'll also be affirming or adjusting the authority in terms of making decisions through the process. And you'll be agreeing on how much uncertainty you're willing to bake into your budget. This may also be a time where, when you think about the budget approach, you might put a preliminary stake in the ground on the type of budget, whether that might be a surplus, a deficit, or a break-even budget, so that you, again, have the rules of the road in play. And then the first step can be developing your draft expense budget. And so at this point, you're really thinking about, over the defined period of time, what are the projected costs or expenses to reach the program goals we've put forward? And so this is where you're really looking at the cost side of the equation and seeing how much is it going to take to move it forward. The next step then, drafting your income budget. And again, remembering that this is not that match process of saying, well, we've developed our draft expenses, so we're just going to match an income to that. This is really looking at projecting your income based upon current fundraising and revenue activities. And at this point, that gives you a draft of each side of your budget, and then you can review that completely together. And this is your opportunity to, again, pull out those organizational goals, pull out the programmatic objectives, to review and discuss every assumption that you put into place, and then make adjustments. And so if you wanted a break-even budget for your organization, this may be where you start to do some cutting here, some increasing there, and figuring out where could we add some stretch without making it unrealistic. And at that point, you're going to be reviewing your final draft, all of your goals and objectives against your budget, so that ultimately you can take that to the committees as appropriate, depending upon your structure. And then ultimately, you'll be presenting that to the board for approval. And in presenting that to the board, you'll need to make sure that you can tell the story of the budget. This is a strong opportunity for leaders within the sector and within the organization who can bring the financial acumen and financial savvy together with a storytelling approach. Because you will have people on your board who are not, numbers are not math, they don't speak math, numbers are not their first or second language, and they need to be able to understand the budget in a very detailed way as well. And so approving the budget is bringing forward the numbers and the narrative. And that ultimately also helps you document your budget decisions. So this is creating the spreadsheet, having the file, the talking points, your assumptions written down so that it becomes part of the historical record and the reference that the organization can make moving forward. Then you'll move into implementing your budget. That's the exciting part. So that's when you're taking it into management responsibilities, updating accounting systems accordingly, and figuring out how you're really going to monitor and report. Because ultimately, part of the flow is the ongoing assessment of your financial performance. And so this is figuring out, are we providing quarterly budgets versus actual? What sort of frequency are we providing? How are we updating our dashboard? All of those sorts of questions. And so that becomes ultimately the flow of your process. And it's incredibly important in something that is a nice standard. And there is, again, you have to take this as a basis and then make it your own. Figure out how this can become adapted and tweaked to really serve your organization in the varying levels of expertise and engagement that you have. And so just as you might plan your day, it's important to plan your budget. And that is a process and a flow that you're going through. And so important to plan and pulling in information and then to give it enough time. And so if you think about when should we be doing this? When should we be starting this process? Typical budget processes begin 3 to 6 months before the end of the fiscal year. And again, this is standard. Some organizations are more in a constant state of budgeting, but give yourself enough time. If you're thinking about doing it a month before the end of the fiscal year, remember it's going to be really hard to get everyone aligned and thinking forward about what the implications for the organization should be. And as I mentioned earlier, think about that end milestone as being the last board meeting before the start of the new fiscal year. And if your last board meeting happens to be, 5 to 7 days before the start of the new fiscal year, you may want to either make that meeting earlier in that final month or move your budget approval to the 2 months prior to the start of the new fiscal year in order to provide staff enough time to really digest the approved document and make any appropriate adjustments or system changes that might need to be done. And so it's, again, important to give it enough time. And then there was you may have heard me mention through here, this concept of assumptions and building not only the numbers, but also the narrative to your budget. Critically important to document assumptions. And this is something that I have seen as a deficiency in many nonprofits with which I've worked, is that they'll talk about their assumptions, but they don't put them in writing. And when those assumptions aren't in writing, it's hard to hold people accountable. And it's also hard for people to remember why that number was what it was. And so including in those assumptions can be a 1 to 2 page document. It does not need to be anything extremely extensive. And it is by category. So you may have an area that starts out with oversight, and that might be just highlighting whether or not there are any regulatory changes that are affecting the organization's operations. And so, for instance, this year there may have been a bullet item in your assumption sheet that would have had to do with the FLSA changes in terms of exempt and non-exempt status and the change threshold and what impact that was going to have on your nonprofit. That might be one line in there. You essentially are looking for the types of things that would affect your financial flow. Another key component is staffing. And so in that assumption area of your document, you might have in there the documentation of you assumed a 3% increase in staff salaries for these classifications of staff. You may have something in there that talks about the increase in positions. So for instance, your assumption document might highlight that there was an additional 1.5 FTE in program area A, plus a reduction of 0.5 FTE in administration. And so your programs area might indicate that you're anticipating a static service volume on A, B, and C program, an increase of 10% on program D, and a decrease on program E. And so again, it's capturing the intended activity over the defined period of time. For your fundraising, here what you might be highlighting is that you're expecting a X dollar amount or a Y% increase in fundraising from major donors, or if there's been a change in the event strategy that you're doing, or the number of appeals that you may be sending out. Again, just one sentence descriptions of the activity that you're anticipating over the year. Operations, that might be an area where you're noting there was a significant technology investment that the organization was undertaking. And so again, creating that nice one-page document that will give you the list of assumptions that become the basis for the narrative that board members and others can carry forward when defending the financial decisions of the organization. Another component that you may find incredibly valuable is actually having a financial policy. And in this, ultimately, again, since the board of directors is responsible for overseeing that financial management, having a strong financial policy and writing that down is a great start for controls. And so the policy is capturing your high-level controls, guided by a philosophy, informed by delineated authority throughout the organization, and then supported by articulated responsibilities and then expectations. And for instance, your policy might state that the organization strives to create surplus budgets that feature realistic revenue projections and conservative expense projections, so that as a matter of policy, people know where the organization stands. And for sophisticated organizations, it might note that a balanced budget would include depreciation expense and a specified amount to increase a cash reserve as determined by a multi-year capital budget, for instance. And so it really is putting, again, in words and in documentation, the key aspects of how you make financial decisions and frame your budgeting process. And so can clarify budget line items and really think of it as this how-to sort of document. So if you have a new treasurer, a new finance chair, a new director of finance, a person who really wants to be a stronger leader and financial aware in the organization, this is the way it's done for the organization. And it really does not have to be grueling, in part because if we pull from some Lean Six Sigma principles, borrow and repurpose. Go online, search for the Nonprofits Assistance Fund sample financial policy, and know that you can adapt it for your organization, but it gives you a place to start. Plagiarism and these sorts of things is okay as long as you're making it work for your organization. And so it's really the most important thing to think about ensuring people know what needs to be done. And the value add of budgeting is really thinking about the fact, as Peter Drucker put forward, unless commitment is made, there are only promises and hopes and no plans. So unless you have an approved budget to which the board and the key leadership have made their commitments, all you have are promises and hopes to move that mission forward, but not the sustainability behind a plan. And that's not the situation that as leaders in the sector and as employees or those who serve the sector, we really want to find any organization. So going through a strong budgeting process that is capturing the revenues, the costs, the resources in a specified period of time, featuring those projections about future growth is essential and critical. And so as we wrap up this afternoon, thinking about those good budgeting baselines, they are built by people who know the needs. So this is a reinforcement to ensure that you're engaging direct line staff as well as management staff, as well as committee chairs, finance committee members, and overall board members in your process. Bring in the people who know what the needs and the opportunities in the organization are, and then be prepared to stretch your mind, to stretch their minds, and to stretch the organization to move forward sustainably. Good budgets are the responsibility of the board to steward. And so this does not absolve staff from the responsibility of making good day-to-day choices, but knowing that the board also has that responsibility for stewarding the budget, for ensuring that there's plenty of time built in to plan for it, that it's pulling from history to forecast that future, and doing that in a responsible way. Because the good budgeting is also going to reflect that realistic view of the most expected future. Budgeting time is not the time to dream big dreams. Budgeting time is the time to take those big dreams and see what aspects can become reality, and to be able to really support that and move it forward. Good budgets also help the organization adapt to changing circumstances. If you have a strong budget built on clear assumptions that have been documented, as your landscape changes, you can pull that information back out, do an assessment of the change, and see how you need to adapt moving forward. And whether that is a windfall of revenue that wasn't expected, or the flip side of being a cut in program funding. But a strong budget with clear assumptions and narrative helps the organization adapt more quickly. And that's why that narrative is so important. Because if you can tell the story and move that forward, you're able to compel more donors to demonstrate financial confidence and to be able to really move the mission forward with great intention. So a budget is going to be the financial reflection of the organization's strategic intent, going hand in hand together and really helping to move the organization and the people forward. And so remembering that as we move forward in developing our own leadership in the sector, understanding that budgeting needs to be a core component, understanding the financial lingo, the processes involved with that can go a long way in making us stronger as leaders and in strengthening the organizations within the sector. So please feel free to add in some questions that you maybe have been holding back on until the very end. We have a few moments for that. And as you're preparing, hopefully, to type some of those questions or feedback, reminder of upcoming sessions for our Nonprofit Leadership Development Series. Compelling communication coming up in July, followed by fabulous fundraising in August. And then in September, we'll talk about taming transitions. We talked earlier in this seminar about the ongoing aspect of change in the nonprofit sector and overall. So we'll go through some theory and some practice for helping people manage change and move through transitions very appropriately. Then on to marketing, accountability, and then in December, some tools and techniques for looking back and looking ahead for your organization. So I'd like to thank you for joining us today to talk about baseline budgeting and learn some more as we've gone through the process. The recording will be made available to those who have registered, as will a survey request be issued to get feedback from you on this webinar, as well as any others that you have attended or may attend going forward. So with that, we'll leave the line open for another minute for any questions, and go forward and be very strong in how you are advancing financial literacy and building up your own as well. So thank you for joining us here today. Have a great afternoon.